If the president says it's time to rip the waste out of our great nation's budget, the nickel would be the place to start, wouldn't it? Let's go to the beginning now, and what this means for the United States as the institutionalist you are to say goodbye to the penny. Are you doing okay?
No, I mean, this is really a moment that arguably should have happened 20 years ago. That's when we started, that's when the penny started costing more to make than it was worth. And there were jokes on TV shows like The West Wing about how useless the penny was. One of the reasons why there are 300 billion pennies in circulation, according to the Treasurer's estimate, is because they are so useless in the eyes of consumers. You know, if you actually were using them, they wouldn't be in circulation. People would be spending them and not putting them in jars in their basements where most of those 300 billion pennies are.
Right.
So it just, you know, it's one of those things where everybody that I talked to in Washington kind of saw the penny as a joke for a long time, but up until the Super Bowl moment with that tweet, people weren't willing to take on this issue.
The Super Bowl moment, Dan Flatley, I'm sure you could feel the ground shake at the Treasury when this took place. I'm curious what happens. We're going to talk to a congressman from Pennsylvania a little bit later on, the ranking member on the Budget Committee. What happens to this mint that's been making these since the 1700s, Dan?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, Joe. I mean, I'm sort of a rank nostalgist, so, you know, losing the penny, I felt a little sad. There were some great pieces yesterday. You know, we wrote about it, obviously, but basically everybody who covers Treasury wrote something. It was kind of a unique moment because everybody who covers Treasury wrote something about the demise of the penny, and they all sort of had their own unique kind of take on it. I think the Times did like an obituary of the penny, and you know, our friends over at the Wall Street Journal did something, you know, in a similar vein. And so, yeah, it was definitely a moment. I do think, you know, it's not a small thing. You know, Steve probably has the figures closer at hand, but let's say it's roughly around 3/4 of all transactions are done digitally now. Maybe there's a fourth or so that are still done in cash. But for those transactions that are conducted in cash, you have to give exact change a lot of times. It varies state to state. There's a sort of a patchwork of laws, but it does create some complications. I'm not saying that it's a reason to keep the penny around forever necessarily, but it does create some complications. And so you did have a couple of folks yesterday come out, including a association representing retailers, saying Congress needs to act here, provide some clarity, and that's kind of what we're waiting for now. So we'll see. I'd be curious to hear what the representative has to say.
Well, we'll get into this a little bit later on. Brendan Boyle will be here. So Dan points us to the real news here. This isn't just a nostalgia show, although I know there are some folks who are feeling a little sad right now. Retailers, Steve, want Congress to authorize rounding prices up to override state and local laws and food stamp regulations. We invoke SNAP here against the practice. So we're not going to see any more $2.99, $3.99. And then by extension, once they get rid of the nickel, what's the point anyway? Why don't we just charge dollars?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is for the 84% and rising of people who pay with digital dollars already, they're going to see no difference. What the big fight is that the retailers, I think what they don't want is if, say, you're owed 3 cents change, they don't want to have to give you 5 cents. They want to keep that 2 cents. So even though pennies, you know, are kind of worthless, if you're the Walmarts of the world or the Targets of the world and you have to deal with millions and millions of these transactions a year, that could, you know, affect their bottom line to the tune of millions of dollars. So this is sort of the lobbying fight. They also want to get clarity, so there's one rule across the country, not a patchwork of state laws. And there are some regulatory hurdles involving SNAP benefits. There are bills in Congress. They have been debated. It's possible it could be included in one of these upcoming spending bills. But, you know, this is the culmination of decades of lobbying to keep the penny, specifically by the company that's made the billions and billions of blanks in Tennessee called Artisan. They funded lobbying campaigns, and they were very successful for a long time until it got, frankly, so ridiculous that we're spending almost 4 pennies to make every penny, and most of those pennies go straight into the trash drawer.
The penny lobby. We're going to blow the lid off of that one next, although maybe it doesn't exist anymore. I guess that's the point of this. You still carrying change around, Steve?
No, I mean, I haven't used cash in a very long time, except for occasionally to like tip the person who cuts my hair. The only person I've seen in the U.S. Capitol pay with pennies in the last couple of years have basically been really old senators who are sort of stuck in their ways, and you're kind of waiting behind them in line, and you're thinking, I'm thinking to myself, okay, this guy is wasting 10 seconds of his very valuable time, because they're a U.S. senator, 10 seconds of my very valuable time, 10 seconds of the cashier's time, and then that penny has to go be counted and then sent to a bank on a truck, and then from the bank to the Fed on another truck, and from the Fed to a retailer on another truck for a penny. And it just strikes me as kind of silly that we still have them. But it is a part of Americana. A penny saved is a penny earned, a penny for your thoughts. And we are losing something, except there are 300 billion out there. Now, here's one thing that the government doesn't. One thing the government really does not want you to do. They don't want people to panic and give them back their pennies. The last thing the government needs is to have 300 billion pennies returned to banks this week. That's one of the reasons, I think, why the treasurer is saying, hey, it's still legal tender. You don't need to give it to us real fast. Because there have been studies done on this. But when John McCain tried to get rid of the penny during the first Trump administration, that warned, hey, it would cost us lots and lots of money if people did that, because we don't have the facilities to securely store 300 billion pennies.
Rick Davis is listening to this. We're going to talk to him in a moment about John McCain's role here. Dan, you carrying change around? You keep a couple dollars in your pocket?
Joe, I come not to praise the penny, but to bury it. But, I will give 2 quick thoughts, in response to Steve's commentary there. I mean, one, I was at the drugstore over the weekend, and all the cash registers, the self-serve thing, everything went down at the same time. And the clerk behind the counter said, do you have any cash? Of course, I said, no, I don't have any cash. So I had to put my stuff back and walk out because they weren't conducting transactions digitally. So that does happen from time to time. And the other thing was, I thought on a more, again, nostalgic note, but, Derek Tyre, who's performing the duties of the deputy secretary, was at the Mint yesterday. And one of the things that he said, which was interesting, was he noted that the penny bears the imprint of Abraham Lincoln. And he talked about the history there. And he did say, which I thought was kind of funny, and I put it in the story, but he said, as somebody who has studied and practices accounting, I appreciate, that Abraham Lincoln was always diligent about getting everybody the penny, down to the exact change and all of that. So, I mean, I think to Steve's point, we're probably better off without the penny. It makes sense, but I will miss it.